It's my pleasure again to introduce our next speaker. Drew Swanson is someone who can speak with great authority about low-country plantations on the Georgia coast. He spent considerable time researching the evolution of Wormslow over 3 centuries that resulted in his masterful book, Remaking Wormslow Plantation, The Environmental History of a Low-Country Landscape, published by the University of Georgia Press. It won the Georgia Historical Society's Malcolm Bell Jr. and Muriel Barrow Bell Award for the best book in Georgia history in 2012. Drew has worked as a farmer, zookeeper, and natural resource manager before turning to academia. Above all, he is an accomplished scholar, received his PhD in history from the University of Georgia, and is currently a member of the history department at Wright State University in Ohio. He recently published a second book with Yale University Press entitled A Golden Weed, Tobacco and Environment in the Piedmont South. He is the author of numerous articles and chapters in other books and has received multiple awards. This morning he will be talking about coastal Edens, imagining low-country plantation environments from both sides of the Civil War. Please welcome Dr. Drew Swanson.
Thank you, Stan. I feel like I've been oversold. Maybe the master of knowledge about one coastal plantation, but I'll extrapolate from there. Can you hear me okay in the back? Volume is fine? Good. I do want to say first that I feel exceptionally honored to be a part of this. I feel like a very small fish in an impressively big pond here, both in terms of the other presenters, but also in this distinguished audience who I'm afraid knows much more about the Georgia Lowcountry than I do. I also want to thank Paul for putting this together, all the hard work that I know went into it, and the Ossabaw Island Foundation, Armstrong State, Georgia Power for their sponsorship, and also especially, at least on my part, to the Wormslow Institute for Environmental History and its director, Sarah Ross, and Craig and Diana Barrow, who are so instrumental in the Institute. They've helped here for this, but they've been exceptionally important to my research, especially its early stages, and supporting me. So I want to take this opportunity to thank them one more time. So, as Stan said, the title of this talk is Coastal Edens, Imagining Plantation Environments from Both Sides of the Civil War. I want to start with a sort of ridiculous statement, if you will, and then back away from it, try to quantify it or qualify it a bit. And that statement is that the Civil War led to modern coastal Georgia conservation. I think that's an exaggeration. I don't think it's completely true, but I do think there is a kernel of truth in that statement that I hope I'll be able to explore effectively today. So the place I want to start is with a guidebook from 1937, published by a New Deal agency, a guidebook called the Intercoastal Waterway. It had some advice for boaters who were plying the waters of Georgia's Fancy Bluff Creek past St. Simon's Island. The guide told them to look east. And there, across the salt flats, swaying with marsh grass, there was a remnant of the historic South, sort of sleepily moldering, if you will. And we see a picture of it here. That remnant was Retreat Plantation. It had once been the home of William Page and his enslaved laborers and family. It was an estate complete with botanical gardens that John James Audubon had called a fairyland. An agricultural journal editor in 1833 had likewise described Retreat and the entire island as a vast wonderland of nature well managed. It was a landscape where not only all of the valuable crops of the South are cultivated in rotation, but where they are also prepared for market on the place, and where every arrangement exhibits both science and skill. It may fairly challenge comparison with any establishment in the United States. But all was not well, the guidebook went on. Alas, the fairyland was no more. For, quote, the Civil War put an end to the gay plantation life of St. Simon's Island, many of the homes being burned, the church used for stabling horses, and the fields laid waste. Few of the old families returned later to the scene of their former affluence. I think this story is a useful place to talk, or to start this talk, because it symbolized two strains of thought about the coastal Lowcountry that had sort of emerged full-formed by the 1930s. On the one hand, these representations tended to characterize the coast as a place for outdoor recreation, a place to play. It was a place to boat, to hunt, to hike, and so on. And that recreation relied on relatively wild landscapes, according to this interpretation. On the other hand, it was popular to represent the coast at the same time through its past built environments, its plantation landscapes, if you will, and their ruin and decay, at least as it was portrayed. So this side of the interpretation focused on those old South plantation landscapes that had been brought low by the Civil War. And of course, the Civil War had triggered dramatic shifts in how low country environments were represented, especially plantation landscapes. And these representations, I'll argue, really influence use of the landscape going forward. They carry over well into the 20th century. But first, we'll turn to the antebellum era and how these plantation landscapes were commonly or popularly, at least through elite eyes, represented. From the 1830s to 1860 or so, leading up to the war, coastal planters and many travelers as well, observing the coast, tended to focus on these plantation landscapes as the representative environments, in some ways, of the Georgia lowcountry. Now, to be clear, they did write about swamps and marshes, dark and tangled forests. Those make their way into the narrative, but more than anything else, they quite often wrote about plantations, what they looked like, what they imagined them to represent. These accounts tended to marvel at the intensive agriculture that you could find on a Sea Island cotton plantation or a rice plantation, some of the details of which Mark gave us last night if you were here for his talk. They marveled at the effort, almost exclusively by slave labor, to drain swamp and marsh, to embank field, and to clear forest. And they were very clear that they found this landscape that resulted quite beautiful. Not just impressive, but they found it beautiful, if you will. They often argued that order, coupled with the potential for profit, made these landscapes attractive. Right? There was beauty to be found in this order. Now, they tended to dwell on a few sort of key places in the landscape, things that we don't often, at least with our modern eyes, associate with beauty. They wrote sentence after sentence about ditches. Right? Ditches just reappear, right? The beauty of ditches, how straight they were, how deep they were, and so on. They wrote about earthen embankments. They wrote about floodgates and roads and so on. So they wrote about parts of nature that people had manipulated to make the landscape more productive. At least that's the way they sold it. They also loved these nexuses of nature and technology. They admired these as well. So they loved to write about modern cotton gins. Right? You can read more about new roller gins than you perhaps ever would like to in some of these pieces. They write about rice mills, barns, even new slave housing. And they portray all of these things as machines of sorts. Right? Machines meant to amplify the power or the potential of nature, even as they sought to control it. They also loved to write about experimental spaces, right? Spaces where planters were tinkering with what they might produce, or spaces where they were trying out new varieties of crops or so on. So they'll write about orange groves and experiments with olives and black pepper bushes. They'll write about stands of sugar cane. They'll even write about bookkeeping techniques and new plans for plantation labor slave management. They often associated these with order and beauty, oddly enough. They saw all of them as an effort to extract further profit from plantation landscapes. A few planters and a few plantations came to epitomize, to sort of stand in and represent these ideas. One of the most famous is Thomas Spalding of Sapelo Island. The Spalding family had been instrumental in making Sea Island cotton a low-country staple, and Thomas was an exceptionally active agricultural improver in the language of the time. A dabbler, if you will, dabbler's the wrong word. He's very serious about this. Engaged in pursuing new crops, new livestock, new agricultural techniques. He published numerous articles about these efforts in the agricultural press. They often highlighted his efforts on his own plantation or talked about what was happening on the landscapes of neighboring plantations. And in turn, other members of the agricultural press often visited Spaulding's plantation. And again, were quite impressed. They wrote about beautiful fields of sugarcane, about plantation margins covered in Bermuda grass, which wasn't yet the enemy at this time. They wrote about orange trees planted along stream banks and those ditches again to help stabilize soil at the same time that they provided fruit and fragrance and beauty. So Spaulding stood in as a popular representation. Another one that got a great deal of press was James Hamilton Cooper's Hopeton on the Altamaha. Did I do that? Is that roughly? Every time I try it, it comes out slightly different. So if I was reasonably close, I'll stick with that. They write a great deal about Hopeton Plantation, near the mouth of that river in Glenn County. And again, it often stood in to represent these broader, imagined and real plantation landscapes. One example of a representation of Hopeton, J.D. Laguerre, in 1833, made a trip down the coast, surveying and writing about a set of plantations on the Georgia Sea Islands mainly. And Laguerre was a South Carolinian editor of the Southern Agriculturalist, a reasonably popular agricultural magazine. And he wrote of Hopeton, a passage that sort of captures this emphasis on order and celebrates its beauty at the same time. So Laguerre said, "On emerging from a few shrubs on the margin of the river, the whole of the Hopeton establishment burst on the view and was truly a beautiful sight. The large white mansion, situated on an eminence rising somewhat abruptly from the fields and partly concealed by shrubbery, the steam mill and sugar establishment with the lofty chimney, from the top of which arose and gently curled the light blue smoke, the various offices neatly whitewashed, and which showed to advantage as half seen, half hid by shrubbery, they appeared and disappeared as you advanced along the bank, formed a sight truly pleasing." Now, I think it's useful to note that this coastal emphasis on order and the beauty of order, I think, came in part out of defensiveness. Right? Defensiveness over a number of things. Defensiveness over the fact that it was easier to say these things than to truly accomplish them, which again Mart noted last night. But also a defensiveness about the growth of the broader South as a region. The coast by this point in time was facing increasing competition from the old Southwest, those cotton lands of Mississippi and Alabama and Louisiana, and then in the last decades before the war, increasingly from Texas and Arkansas as well. So nature in the West seemed to promise to displace the power and the influence and the profitability of coastal environments. And coastal planters worried that their neighbors, their sons, their daughters would end up somewhere out west. They had personal fears tied up in this too. So agricultural improvement, I think, is in some ways a response to this fear. It is a defensive action, but also stressing the orderly beauty of the coast and the continued profitability of coastal plantations was I think, a reaction to this growing power of the West. Right? It's an assertion of their continued relevance. A pop cultural place from the time to see this is actually in the writing of William Gilmore Simms. He's the South's most prominent man of letters in the age. At least he'd tell you that, I'm certain. Simms was a poet, a novelist, a historian. He's best known, of course, for his historical fictions of the colonial South, but he also wrote a series of frontier novels. Often they've been compared to the work of Cooper, but for the South. And in these frontier novels, which he wrote in the 3 decades leading up to the Civil War, he tended to stress a wild, uncivilized Southwest, and often used the Low Country as the benchmark against which to judge it. The Low Country was this nature and society idealized, if you will, often in Simms's writing. And Simms was from the South Carolina Low Country, so we can assume that it's his birthplace in many ways that he's hearkening back to. A good passage to see this comes from Border Beagles. Has anyone read Border Beagles? So it's a thrilling read. It moves pretty quickly. In Border Beagles, Sims has the character Mr. Horsey talking to a younger Harry Vernon who's about to set out for the Yazoo country of Mississippi. And he makes this very sort of explicit claim about landscapes that I think is worth quoting. So Horsey says to Vernon, "What the devil would a man expect to find out away on the very outskirts, as I may call it, of civilization? Would you have gentlemen and Christians in a part of the world where there's no timber cut, no lands cleared, no houses built, nothing done but what's done by the squatters and that sort of people?" So in Border Beagles, but also in other novels like Richard Hurtis and Guy Rivers and Helen Halsey, often figures from the coast are drawn or lured west by the promise of this fresh nature, only to be disturbed by what they find when they get out there in these wilder landscapes. So nature is often portrayed as this corrupting force, more or less. Again, seeming to assert the value of order and the intensive form of agriculture that existed along the coast. Even observers who often had very little kind to say about southern landscapes could find some beauty in the Georgia lowcountry. A good place to see this is Frederick Law Olmstead, who sort of notoriously railed against slovenly southern farms and forests as he roamed the South, writing for largely northern audiences. But Olmstead, who did visit the coast, actually liked portions of it. He found it attractive, even when he seemed to try to resist the impulse. So in the Cotton Kingdom, which pulled together his earlier travel narratives into one collection, Olmstead presented the problems of the South and slavery as he read them for northern audiences, largely northern audiences. But he also has a passage in there about coastal plantation landscapes. In fact, in one instance, he compares the Georgia lowcountry favorably to Holland in terms of its intensive and careful management and the beauty of the resulting landscapes. And then you can almost see him in the text sort of realize what he's done. He realizes he's just compared one of the epicenters of the Protestant work ethic, if you will, to this Southern slave society that he's so prominently critiquing. And so he does a bit of an about face to justify why these landscapes are so pleasing. He basically argues that it was the New England connections of many of these low-country planters that must have stimulated the sort of Yankee industry that made these orderly and attractive spaces. But nonetheless, he did find them attractive and impressive. The Civil War and Emancipation would mark a sea change in low-country society, agriculture, and in portrayals of the land and landscapes. Talk of ruin, and the actual word was used quite often, talk of ruin, at least from white observers, we'll get to that in a few minutes, overpowered this earlier emphasis on order, with, I think, lasting repercussions. We can see this many places. The first place really is in a wave of travelers to the South in the immediate aftermath of the war. In many ways, we might define these travelers as disaster tourists of a sort. They're there to see the hard hand of war and what it has wrought. Right? Most of them are northern. Many of them are traveling south to write a book about what they see or as correspondents to northern newspapers or magazines. So they're disaster tourists in and of themselves, but also for a larger northern audience intent on what they will report back. So this includes figures like John Trowbridge and Whitelaw Reid and Richard Dennett, to name a few of the most famous ones. And a number of them visit the Georgia coasts in the months after the war. And they tended to write about landscapes that exhibited, at least from their perspective, a comforting level of ruin. What they saw was a bit reassuring. So they included passages about burned bridges, torn up railroads, but also abandoned plantations and rice and cotton fields, regrowing in saplings, and so on. Trowbridge, for example, as he approached Savannah from the west, as he moved through the countryside and drew closer to the city, He frankly admired scenes that showed that Sherman's soldiers had, in his words, got used to their wild business by the time they arrived there. And the general had, I suspect, slipped one glove off. I think it's interesting to note that a number of these observers found Bonaventure Cemetery, here on the outskirts of the city, a particularly fascinating place to look at and think about this idea of ruin and decay. Not a classic plantation landscape, really, but a lot of their descriptions begin to set this idea, if you will. Whitelaw Reid found it enchanting, though at the same time he saw in it a disheveled beauty that was evidence in his mind of a general Southern lack of industry. He tended to portray it as amazingly beautiful, considering the fact it had been run by Savannans. That's his basic sales pitch. Imagine what Bonaventure could be in the future. But nonetheless, he found it beautiful. But no traveler reveled in the cemetery more than John Muir. Muir, in 1867, sets out on this odd, strange, beautiful journey from the upper Midwest toward the Gulf of Mexico. And he ends up spending a good deal of time, if you're not familiar with his story, in Savannah. Essentially, he's waiting on some money so he can continue his journey, and it takes longer than he expects. But while he's in Savannah, out of poverty mainly, but also his own inclination, he camps out in Bonaventure Cemetery. And at first, out of necessity, but eventually he comes to love the place, or at least that he writes that he does. He's infatuated with it. And it was the very atmosphere of decay, or at least the decay of human order, that Muir so appreciated. So here's a passage from him about Bonaventure. It is interesting to observe how assiduously nature seeks to remedy these labored art blunders. She corrodes the iron and marble, and gradually levels the hill, which is always heaped up, as if a sufficiently heavy quantity of clods could not be laid on the dead. Strong evergreen arms laden with ferns and tillandsia drapery are spread over all. Life at work everywhere, obliterating all memory of the confusion of man. So here we see some of sort of a representative Muir passage in many ways that would be recognizable in California or someplace else, but written about this southern landscape and focused on this idea of decay, but for Muir at least a sense of regeneration as well. And in the decades to follow, other locals and outside observers would make similar observations about the pervasiveness of post-war ruin in the coastal plantation districts, and they would speculate about what it meant. I think one category that merits some extended discussion is that of northern hunters and sportsmen. They wrote quite often, when they came south after the war, about once agricultural land reverting to wilder states. And they saw explicit recreational opportunities in this transition. Reading, for example, Forest and Stream magazine, which was a popular publication for upper-class sportsmen that catered largely to a northeastern audience, revealed a deep interest in the Georgia coast. So you can find dozens of articles from the 1870s, the 1880s, the 1890s that dwelt on the hunting and fishing opportunities of the Sea Islands in particular. One example, in an extended anonymous letter to the editor, tied together the decay of an old order and this new outdoor recreation opportunity, at least as the writer saw it. And he wrote, "The plantations are abandoned, most of them, and countless bevies of quail forage in the old fields. Herds of deer and droves of turkeys and coons come out of the hammocks into the overgrown garden patches to feed on the succulent plants that have come up spontaneously year after year from self-sown seed. Here and there is an old concrete chimney made of cemented oyster shells where an overseer's house once stood, or the decaying remnants of some Negro quarter hidden in a tangle of orange trees, catbriers, sprawling fig trees, vines, and palmetto scrub." One of the more famous sportsmen captivated by this coast was Frederick Ober. Ober's an interesting figure. He's a Massachusetts naturalist and a travel writer, In fact, he was quite well known in his day as a travel writer. He publishes something like 24 books or so, I think, many of which sold quite well. I think there's a dissertation here, if anyone's looking for a topic in the audience. Ober's best known for his travel and his writing about the Caribbean and Latin America, books like Travels in Mexico, that's up on the slide here. But in the 1870s, Ober spent a good deal of time along the northeast Florida coast and the Georgia coast, hunting mainly, it seems, but also writing back pieces from his experience for magazines. In 1880, he submitted a substantial article to the popular Lippincott's magazine, in which he wrote about Cumberland Island. And again, he makes these same sort of connections. So Ober wrote, "Cumberland today is nearly depopulated. The fertile cotton and cornfields run to waste. Wild hogs and half-wild horses roam over the pasture and scrub that cover once cultivated fields. Within the old borders of Mulberry Grove proper, ruin everywhere stares you in the face. On every side are deserted fields and gardens, fields that employed the labor of 400 Negroes, fields that were fertile and yielded large crops of the famous Sea Island cotton." But then in the very next paragraph, he moves on to talk about long, rich descriptions of the hunting and fishing that this affords. So it's part ruin, part playground, as Ober sells it. And you can find many other similar descriptions of the coast from this era. They came from locals, they came from newcomers, and they came from travelers. You could find these descriptions in the accounts of local yachting and gun clubs that used old plantation docks or old plantation fields for their activities. You could find it in regional newspapers that decried what they saw as decay and touted the growth opportunities of the coast. You found it, of course, in wealthy Northerners who moved to the Sea Islands, from the Carnegies to the Coffins to the Reynoldses. Now, we'll hear a lot more about this in future presentations, so I won't focus on it right now. But as they bought up portions of the Sea Islands in particular, they often focused on restoring in some form or fashion old plantation homes, even as they were building their own new lavish estates. And they too quite often talked about the ruin that they bought into, but also about the opportunities that it presented, as they imagined them at least. So was there any reality to any of this? Is it all just rhetoric? That's tough to get at in some ways. I think one place to get at it a bit, some figures come from the census that bear out some of the anecdotal observations. The old plantation landscapes had changed, and they had shrunk, at least to some extent. One of the things the census takers recorded were acres of improved farmland. What they meant by this usually was land that was in field or land that was in pasture. These statistics are not nearly as precise as they might seem. They have their problems. Exactly what was improved was often a discretionary thing. And these figures depended a great deal on people's memory or the veracity of their accounts when asked and so on. But nonetheless, I think they do represent something that was real. They have some legitimacy. So what the census takers found is if you tracked acres of improved farmland across the censuses, there was a pretty dramatic decline in the 6 coastal counties from 1860, after the war, bottoming out in 1880. And from 1880, improved farmland in the 6 counties would slowly climb again to this moment of prosperity just after World War I in 1920. This is broken down on this slide by counties, which probably makes it more confusing than necessary. You can see that 4 of the 6 counties, Camden, Chatham, Glenn, and McIntosh, suffer real declines and never recover in terms of improved acreage. 2, Bryan and Liberty, will actually bounce back by the 1920s to exceed the 1860 figure. I think what's going on in those 2 cases is that they're the 2 counties that extend furthest inland, and most of the later agricultural growth seems to be along their inland edges instead of the coast. So if we could isolate the coastal strip itself, I think it's even more dramatic than the numbers for the counties as a whole suggest. But to total them, which I didn't do unhandily for you on this slide, In 1860, for the 6 counties in total, there were 152,000 acres, a little over 152,000 acres in improved land, according to the census. By 1880, that had fallen to below 100,000, right? So a decline of more than a third from the whole. And then we'll climb back to 120,000 acres by 1920, but still more than 30,000 acres lower than had been the case in 1860. So the numbers at least suggest that there's a little bit of reality to this rhetoric of ruin. It's also useful to say that there were obviously differing views of this post-war landscape and what it meant. This narrative I've been laying out for you is not the only one. There is real economic growth during the late 19th century on portions of the coast in particular. And it came from a number of places. It came, some of it, from an expanding timber industry and eventually the mastering of the pulp paper process. It will come in places in time from the growth of the sharecropping empire of inland cotton in Georgia. Savannah banks will finance some of that growth, and some of that cotton itself will flow back through the city. And increasingly, it will come from tourist dollars as well. And so you could find boosters in their representation of post-war landscapes that were not intent on remembering the past, but were much more focused on present and future economic opportunities. So there is that counter-narrative, if you will, and the most eloquent and frequent, the most different interpretation of these landscapes came, of course, from African Americans. Landscapes that had been characterized as ruined by many whites were instead environments of opportunity and hope. The collapse of an ordered plantation landscape that was an expression of slavery was hardly something to be lamented, they would be quick to say. And they demonstrated this belief in words and actions, right? In their active pursuit of land ownership and rental opportunities. You could see it. In their maintenance of extensive gardens and small diversified farms on places like Sapelo, you could see it. And in their continued hunting and fishing in these spaces described as decayed, you could see it too. Even as legislation was busily transforming these traditional activities into trespassing and poaching, at least officially. So there are these counter-narratives, but nonetheless, I think this rhetoric of ruin that was so popular in print and in the press had some real durable power and influence. In many ways, it's the New Deal and some New Deal enterprises that help cement this way of thinking, this interpretation. The New Deal, of course, is best known for large-scale government planning projects, infrastructural projects, but it also had an exceptionally important role in shaping national public historical narratives, right, and how we thought about our pasts, especially through various works progress administration endeavors. One of the most important was the Federal Writers Project, which had a Georgia branch, which had a Savannah unit, headed by Mary Granger. And the Savannah unit produced a number of projects that interpreted low-country history in light of the destructive power of the Civil War, and also had something to say about nature and its connection to these things. A few quick places to look at some of this. Drums and Shadows is maybe the best-known project to come out of the Savannah unit. I think I saw some copies on the table out there, giving an endorsement as well. It, of course, was compiled in part from ex-slave, former slave narratives, other interviews conducted along the coast, bits of history written by the Savannah unit writers themselves. You're probably, most of you, familiar with it, but just very quickly, it tended to focus on African-American folklore, religious practice, herbal medicine, and the like. And the book collectively defined African-American culture as durable but superstitious, exotic and therefore titillating for white readers. And to do so, it made sort of a very, I don't know if it's necessarily complex, but it made an argument about nature. Basically, it argued that the emphasized the isolation of Sea Island African-American communities, and essentially did that by arguing that history had stopped with the destruction of the plantation landscapes. Therefore, African-American culture had frozen. It had been trapped in amber, if you will, by the forests and swamps that overtook the plantation landscapes. So this interpretation argued that it was ruin itself that was a preserver, right? It was ruin that had saved these things for the audiences that read them in the book. Along similar lines, the Savannah unit produced a guidebook called simply Savannah that was part of the popular American Guide series. You can find similar books like this for places across the United States written about the same time. Savannah was a blend of local history, and the meat of the book was really guided walking and driving tours. So the walking tours focus on the city, but many of the driving tours tried to pull tourists out into the rural countryside around the city itself, pull them out into those plantation landscapes. And its narrative is very much focused on the contrasting landscapes of the past and the present, the same ideas that we've been talking about. There's an extended passage that I think is worth reading. The guidebook said, "The antebellum Georgia low country was a place where, thanks to prosperity under the agrarian system, plantations grew to be almost like small kingdoms, sufficient unto themselves. The old master in his palatial mansion was the king, and his white tenants and Negro slaves were his subjects. Almost everything the family needed could be grown or manufactured on the efficiently run plantation. But the war between the states completely obliterated this picture of the southern plantation. After the war, families returned to desolate, charred fields to find in the ashes of their proud homes the symbol of a dead prosperity, and many left the scene of their misfortunes never to return. Brambles and trees reclaimed the land as a wilderness, and today the spectator drives for miles past acres of untenanted woods and weedy fields." And then the writers drew a breath and quickly went on to describe the pleasurable historic tours, hunting, horseback riding, golf, surf bathing opportunities presented for the traveler readers that were made possible by this new wilderness. Similar endeavor, the Savannah unit members also conducted a great deal of research on individual plantations, especially in Chatham County. Eventually, these would be compiled as a book. Again, I think I saw it out there on one of the tables, doing good bookseller work here, right? But they were first published in the late 1930s and into the 1940s as a series of articles in the Georgia Historical Quarterly. In total, there would be 20 articles spanning 5 years, 17 journal issues, and 483 pages, examining 12 individual plantations. And a piece on Mulberry Grove Plantation, the one along the Savannah River, not the Cumberland one, captured the collective tone, as it promised to explore the, quote, golden days of prosperity, followed by the war and desolation and ruin. Another New Deal project that wasn't part of the Savannah unit or part of the WPA was the Historic American Buildings Survey, which HABS, as it was commonly known, which accomplished much the same thing. HABS was devoted to recording the nation's antebellum architecture, from the grand to the vernacular. And its low country surveys, however, focused to a great deal, or to a great extent, on those plantation landscapes we've been talking about. They also loved the ruins of Spanish sites as well, I should add. So if you look at the 1930s surveys that HABS conducts along the coast, and you subtract the city homes in Savannah, you're left with 18 surveys. 4 of them are Spanish ruin sites, 10 are plantations. A church, a lighthouse, a keeper's house, and so on rounds out this. But they tended to represent both the past and nature in a very particular way that I'll really fly through quickly here. This scene of Chantilly, I think, is a representative one. First of all, you have a plantation house that itself is still standing, but seems to be in decline, right? It doesn't seem the best cared for when you look closely. Also, these shots are almost always framed like this one is. They're taken from in the woods. The photographer could have pretty clearly, right, stood out on the lawn and gotten a much better shot to describe or to show us what Chantilly looks like, but almost all the shots look like this. He's crept over behind the saw palmetto with the Spanish moss draping down, and you get this image, right, of the maw of nature about to engulf this historic and crumbling plantation. And so I think that's quite purposeful. And we've got to remember that the photographers doing many of this are themselves artists, right? That's how they're thinking of themselves. And they are very artful shots. So I think part of it is art, but part of it is this rhetoric of ruin, if you will. And we can see it even more explicitly if we return to Retreat Plantation. That shot we saw that opened this talk was from this HABS survey as well. But they also surveyed some of the other plantation structures falling into decline. And I think it's particularly interesting to look at this slide and the one I'll show you in just a second of a structure that was labeled slave hospital and greenhouse, sort of a combined facility. And there's accompanying text for some of these surveys that describe what you're seeing. Some of them have very bare outlines, and some are a little more extended treatments. And in this case, the documenters wrote about the antebellum activities of the hospital and the greenhouse. They emphasized that these two structures were symbolic of that orderly, beautiful landscape. Right? Here was a place where slave bodies, the labor that drove that old landscape, was kept in repair. That's how they portray it. But also the place where experimentation and intensive agriculture, that greenhouse, sought to better those landscapes as well. And then it has a sentence that says, but of course the Civil War destroyed all of this glorious stuff. This is the same site panned around from the other side. So HABS did some of this same work too. So what does this all mean? That's a good question. I think it presents a couple of things for us to think about. First, it reveals that ideas about interpretations of nature in the coastal Georgia region often revealed the defensiveness about the past and the present of the Low Country. So that antebellum image of the orderly plantation that mastered nature and generated profits in the bargain was, I think, in part a response to the movement westward. It's also perhaps a response to an increasing Southern defensiveness about slavery as the Civil War approached and national debates grew more strident. And the post-war rhetoric of ruin grew in part, I think, out of white Southern defensiveness about the results of the war. We could read it as another expression of the lost cause. It's a way to remind ourselves that the lost cause was also a force used to describe nature and landscape in the South in the post-war era. I think perhaps even more interesting, though, is that this rhetoric of ruin really shows the long reach of the Civil War and emancipation in the creation of a recreational coast. I think in many ways this emphasis of a built landscape that's still there, but visible as ruins, crumbling, combined with this idea about recreational spaces that are produced as these spaces rewild, really become the model for modern conservation efforts and the portrayal of low country landscapes. Right? Conservation in this region has tended to emphasize this fusion of the historic built environment and its remnants, but also the wilder elements of that landscape. Right? So I think in many ways what conservationists come to try to preserve in the Low Country in the second half of the 20th century will be a reflection of this rhetoric of ruin that was built and then elaborated upon after the Civil War and through the New Deal. That's my sales pitch, at least. Right. Thank you.
I think the challenge was met. Drew, great job.
None of my slides moved.
No points off for that. We've had several requests in the interim that if you have a question to ask, please wait for the microphone to get to you because 99% of this room cannot hear it, and this is really an integral part of our discussion today. So as we have questions, it is 10:56. We're going to go probably 10 minutes for questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. Let the folks who have the microphones come to you after Drew calls on you. Thank you.
Oh.
I just have a comment that in landscape design history, incorporating ruins actually has a very old tradition. You'll see that in Italy and England where ruins are sometimes contrived and they provide a sense of the sublime, and
Where are you at? I'm sorry, I can't.
I'm over here. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. That just helps me to focus.
I guess my point is that this seems to me to be a part of this long tradition of fascination with the past and with sort of a romantic vision, and it's often from the sense or from the perspective of the dominant.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And that's something I obviously did not talk about today. But there's a pretty substantial body of environmental history focused on that sort of American inferiority complex, if you will, early in the nation's history, about its lack of deep human history, its lack of ruins. And I think it's important to note, too, that many of these relatively wealthy planter families had done the grand tour. They'd done the European tour. They visited some of these ruin sites. A few of them play with the idea of building follies, those sort of intentional, made-up ruins, if you will, as a part of the landscape. So I think there was sort of a ready and willing audience to recognize what these places could symbolize, this fusion, if you will. But that is a great point. So I think there is a deeper history here that they recognized as well.
The question is about, I'm over here. The question is about, you mentioned a little bit about these northern writers coming down and looking at these ruins. Was there an abolitionist writer, somebody coming down here kind of seeing if they're just deserts, or anyone who was trying to kind of show this is what they deserved, or any kind of a more pointed view of these ruins kind of being a culmination of the slavery that came before?
Yes. Yeah. Many of them are looking to explain that sort of very thing as they write. Trowbridge had been an abolitionist before the war. Whitelaw Reid is looking for some of this, and it's pretty explicit in some of the stuff that he writes, I think. So yeah, many of them are looking for, as I said, sort of this hard hand of war, and they're finding a great deal of satisfaction in it. One of the things that they sort of often mention or seem to note, sometimes it's a subtext, is this idea that if the landscape could collapse so quickly, right, and so thoroughly, then it must have meant that the system was rotten all along. It must have been hollow on the inside. And so I think part of what they were doing by emphasizing abandoned plantations is they were selecting one of the portions of the South that had been the wealthiest, right? The most intensely reliant on slavery, the epitome of that pre-war antebellum plantation order, and showing how completely it could collapse was a way to make that very argument. So I think you're exactly right. And many of them are looking for what they then find, if you will, which is why we should take some of it with a grain of salt, I think.
Okay, and I was wondering, you say you're talking about both sides, but I think there's a third side, and I know that some of the northern writers, I've found a little research, the transfer of land to the former slaves through the Freedmen's Bureau, and also I know from my research in deed records in Chatham County, a lot of black families were deeded land or bought land and tried to farm it. Have you looked into some of the writings there? I know I've found some accounts by northern reporters about the growth and prosperity of farming by former slaves. And I know from research also that a lot of that land later was taken away from the black owners through taxation. But I think that's a third viewpoint of how the South rebuilt after the war.
Certainly. So you can find a wide range of interpretations of African American use of the landscape after the war from northern white writers. So some of them see a good deal of optimism in what they're witnessing. Right? They see a recreation of the yeoman American farmer, potentially, on these landscapes with former slaves. So some of them will praise what happens. Others will be highly critical, and that criticism will come from a range of places, I think. Some are, frankly, coming from sort of a racist perspective. Others are coming from this idea that this is sort of an incomplete realization of the vision of the redistribution of land, and so on. So they'll run the spectrum, right? So you can find an observer writing almost anything you'd like to select about what these landscapes look like and what they represent. But as I mentioned very briefly in the talk, I think the very pursuit of land ownership, right? And even rental agreements that many freed people pursue so strongly after the war, I think symbolizes this alternate view of what the post-war decline of the plantation means. And it's very much a view of the power that comes through the ownership and the management of nature itself, right? So yes, you can find traveler accounts that say any number of things about what this looks like.
I wanted to know retreat plantation there, and that was turned into a golf course and then rebuilt his house. What?
I'm sorry, it cut out at the end, so I.
So what happened to change things from preserving the ruin and the beauty of the ruin for tourism to demolishing the ruins or rebuilding the ruins to be tourist things? What was the idea behind that? Because they were first tourist attractions, and then they were restoring them.
So the question is, if you couldn't hear it, is about sort of the motivation, right? And why, on the one hand, argue for the importance of ruin, and then on the other hand, for example, clear a retreat to make a golf course, right? What's happening there? Where's the disconnect? In that specific case, I'm not sure what the justification was exactly, the language that was used. There's a certain irony here that's worth noting, and I note it in the broader paper. But as that booklet, the Intercoastal Waterway, is making this sales pitch about the ruin and destruction on St. Simon's, there's a great deal of investment on the island already, right? It's already being developed as this pleasure and playground, and none of that really makes its way into that portion of the guidebook. So maybe the mercenary side of me would say that once you've sold people on the beauty of the place in a way, right, then you can develop it the most profitable way possible. So some of these sites are sort of cast aside. They're remade as these new play places. But even the language and the idea of them, though, persists. And obviously we have preserved a number of them. And I think this is maybe a good point to reiterate something that Mart said, again, in his keynote last night, which is that explaining the nature of where some of this preservation influence comes from doesn't undo the good work that it has done. It's, I think, a call to interrogate those landscapes that we're interpreting a little more closely, both their built environment and how we've represented it, but also their natural spaces. Right? So there are legitimate ecological values in these rewilded places, even though they're not wilderness, even though they're not pristine by some definition, at least. So I think this impulse, even if it is in part a lost cause impulse, which we could rightly criticize in various ways, has at the same time created an important conservation ethic in a particular place that's been lasting and powerful and has done good work. Again, I think we may hear more about that as this conference moves forward as well. So in the specific case of retreat, I'm not sure. But there's this continual tension between selling this vision of the landscape and what's actually happening on the ground in many cases at some times. So St. Simon's is no vast ruin by 1937. It's just not. In fact, there's been money pouring into it for quite a period of time by that date. I think we have time for two more. I've heard. Yes.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Very much enjoyed it, particularly your slide selection. I'm wondering whether the amplification of the power of nature, to use your language, before the war isn't as much a reflection of the labor that produced the very descriptive elements that you provided in your lecture. That is to say, you spoke about the ditches, you spoke about the rice and the cotton, you spoke about various aspects of the pre-war experience as order. And I'm wondering whether there isn't a degree of your narrative informed by the political culture pre-war looking to defend slavery. And similarly, after the war, I'm wondering whether the political culture doesn't inform the degree to which the ruination becomes the narrative spin, if you will. Could you speak to that, please?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I think you phrased it much better than I did in the talk. Yeah, I think we should be careful not to take these statements, right, the long list of quotes that I worked through at the face value. I think in many ways the emphasis of order comes out of this profound worry about disorder. And focusing on those ditches and those rice mills and those floodgates is a bit of a bait and switch, right, on the part of planters, but also on travelers as well. Right? It's this admiration for the products produced by enslaved people that you can focus on rather than the sweat and the toil and the blood of enslaved people themselves. Now, you can find passages that are more explicit about where this order and beauty comes from, usually from the masters themselves and often in more internal documents. Right? So, for example, there is and this one is published, but there's one from the Southern agriculturalist that Thomas Spalding writes, where he very explicitly talks about the pleasure of looking over the bent backs of workers draining a section of marsh. So there is a much franker, I think, look at where this structure of order comes from. And then to quickly address the second part of that, yeah, it's the politics of the post-war era that's a big part of this rhetoric of ruin too. Right? So it's the lost cause, but it's the lost cause used to view landscapes and reinforces what the lost cause says about politics and culture and other things as well. So yeah, we're human beings, right? It's always political, and there is a great deal of bait and switch to this. But I think the language, these perceptions have a power that live on even when we know, right, that there's a great deal of falsity and imagination in them, which I think links to Max's talk earlier, right, of imagination. Because we're always acting in nature, but we're always imagining what that means and what that looks like as well. Do we have time for one more quick one? Okay.
Thanks. This is really more of a comment, but maybe I can draw you out on it. The rhetoric of ruin, a phrase I really like.
Thank you. I'm trying to coin it.
So. To me, there's maybe a progression of that today in land conservation to a rhetoric of ruin and resilience or ruin and recovery, speaking in an ecological sense. And being in land conservation, I find myself using that a lot, rightly or wrongly, to tell the story of an ecosystem that has recovered and is worth protecting. It's different than the message that's used in land conservation in some other parts of the world and situations where you're actually trying to save something that's more close to pristine wilderness. And I just wonder if you see that. Was that where you were going with the post-war narrative? And I guess I would ask some of my fellow land conservation ecologists, is that okay? Are we in fact using the rhetoric of ruin to paint a pretty picture about the land conservation that we need to do, or is it in fact a tangible value of what we're doing in a land management and resilient land recovery sense?
Well, I think ruin is a fascinating term, and I selected it because it appears so often in the historical record. It is the language that they were using. I think it's fascinating because ruin implies narrative, and it implies a moral. We could talk about change and technically mean the same thing, but change doesn't carry that same sort of narrative thread that just saying the word ruin does. Right? Ruin implies a once somehow more perfect landscape brought low. And that is a sort of declensionist narrative that any environmentalist or environmental historian right, feels comfortable. Like we automatically recognize it, right? Here's a story about how we've acted badly in nature, society, whatever, fill in the blank. So I think that use of ruin was very intentional or became very intentional over time. It provided that narrative for what we had done to nature and from many of these observers' perspectives, what we had done to society. So it had a powerful rhetorical purpose. As to whether it's useful in this case, I don't know. I'm torn. Like I said, I think if it motivates real conservation efforts that accomplish good things, then it's tough to completely throw it out. At the same time, it's so firmly entrenched, I think, in ideas about race and the relationships of people in ways that are often destructive, that I think it tends to privilege certain groups and their take on nature, what it's looked like in the past, what it should look like, that I think it's a bit dangerous. At the very least, I think it's a term that we should use with our eyes wide open, right? Sort of be aware of what we're saying when we have ruined the landscape that we now seek to preserve, both in terms of built environment, but also in terms of the natural environment. So I know that's a big waffle, but thank you very much.